The main point of Ecclesiastes 5 is to honor and serve God, not money. And I need to reiterate, Solomon is not saying that serving God is the antidote for vanity in this life. Because even when we serve God, life under the sun is still vain. It's still temporary. It's still unpredictable, baffling, unfair, and stuck on repeat. But honoring and serving God makes the vanity of this life bearable. When we honor and serve God, it sets us free to enjoy the good things in this life and to not be crushed by the bad things. And so in verses 1 through 7, he's telling us to take our service to God seriously, to make sure that we're actually honoring him with our devotion and the way that we live our lives. It's one thing for life under the sun to be vain. That's a given. But if our service to God is vain, well, that's the worst kind of vanity of all. We want our service to God to be of eternal significance and not to just be a vapor or a fleeting breath like everything else in this life. And so he says in verse 1 to guard your steps as you go to the house of God and draw near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. The priests would read God's law at the temple, and he's saying when you draw near, you better be willing to listen and obey God's words rather than bringing sacrifices to him, thinking he's pleased with these animals you're offering, even though you're living in complete disobedience to him. In verse 2, don't be hasty in word or impulsive in thought. It may be that we're plagued by the vanity of this life. And so when we turn to God in prayer, all we do is vent and tell him how terrible everything is because we can't keep anything forever and we're so baffled and everything's out of our control and we're just complaining about how unfair and broken this world is and how bored we are to be stuck on this loop. And Solomon is saying prayer is not just for you to get everything off your chest or to try to manipulate God with long flowing speeches and empty promises and vows to try to get him to do what you want so that this life won't be so hard. Instead, prayer is to show honor and reverence for the Lord. He says in verse 3, the dream comes through much effort and the voice of a fool through many words. The idea is when you're tired at the end of the day because you put in so much work, you're much more likely to dream because your sleep quality is higher. Likewise, if you're stacking words on top of words and you just can't stop speaking, you're likely to say something foolish. And he tells us to take our vows seriously in verses 4 through 7 because it's easy to say to God, Lord, if you get me out of this jam, well, I'm going to give you 50% of my paycheck next week. And then when God comes through for us, we start to think, ooh, maybe that was a mistake. I don't know that I can do 50%. Maybe I'll just give him 20% instead. And Solomon warns when you treat God lightly that way, he's going to be angry in verse 6, and whatever endeavors you hope to accomplish as a result of this vow will likely fail. And he compares empty vows to dreams and fantasies, which again are just vanity. Instead, fear God. He shifts gears in verses 8 and 9 to talk about the oppression of bureaucracy. And he says, don't be surprised when you see leaders oppressing the poor. And if you submit a complaint to them, to their higher ups, chances are the person over them is just as corrupt because the person under them is just serving their interests. And the corruption can go all the way up the chain, even to the king. In verse 9, there's a translation issue. So depending on your version, it's going to read differently. I actually prefer the New King James here, which says, moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. In other words, there's an irony that the leaders often are oppressing the poorest workers out in the field, and yet the whole society is being fed and run from those field workers. The very people that are keeping society afloat are the ones that are so often oppressed. And even the king eats from those fields. And it makes sense after talking about these rich leaders who are oppressing the poor to then transition in verse 10 down through verse 17 to talk about the vanity of striving after riches. And he lists 4 problems with living for money and trying to find satisfaction in wealth. First of all, in verse 10, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money. When you love money, you never have enough. And that's because we're trying to satisfy an infinite longing with finite resources. And that's impossible. And so no amount of money, even if you're the richest person in the world, will truly satisfy your soul. Another problem is in verse 11, when good things increase, those who consume them increase. In other words, the higher your lifestyle, the higher your expenses. expenses. It's amazing that 80% of NFL players go broke within 5 years of retiring from the NFL. Why? Because they bought all these mansions, not just for themselves, but for friends and family members. Well, once you buy a bigger house, now you've got a higher electric bill and higher property taxes and maintenance costs and a bigger lawn to mow. And so if your expenses are 99% of your income, it doesn't matter if you make $50,000 a year or $50 million a year, you're still broke. And in verse 12, when you have a ton of stuff, you can't even sleep well. Number one, because your stomach is so full, you can afford to have a feast every night. And so you're stuffing yourself before bed. And if you're rich, you really don't have to work that hard. And so you're not getting much exercise. And so physically, it's difficult to sleep, but also mentally, it's difficult to sleep because you have so many things that you're worried about taking care of and worried about losing. The more you have, the more there is to lose. And he says in verses 13 and 14, sometimes you do lose all of your stuff. And as hard as you try to hang on to it, it just slips through your fingers. And even if you were to somehow keep all of your riches in this life, we're still going to die and we're going to lose it all in the end anyway. In verses 15 through 17, we come into this world naked as babies and we leave this world naked in death. But for the person who's living for money and trying to find satisfaction and an antidote to life's vanity in their bank account, he says in verse 17, they're miserable. Throughout his life, he eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. It affects his health physically and mentally and spiritually because he's constantly unhappy with how much he has and he wants more. And he's stressed out by all of his expenses and he can't sleep because he's afraid and anxious about losing it all. And then despite his anxiety and all of his attempts to hang on to it, maybe he loses it anyway. And so again, he comes back to the point in verses 18 through 20 that the only way to avoid being crushed by the vanity of this life and to experience little reprieves of joy is to fear God. Because in verse 19, God is the one who allows you to enjoy riches and wealth. If you have wealth but you don't have God, you're not going to enjoy that wealth because you'll be too busy trying to get more and trying not to lose what you have. But when we fear God, verse 20, he occupies us with the gladness of our heart to the point where we're not thinking so much about the vanity of this life anymore. We're not vexed by it. We just accept it and we busy ourselves with the good blessings of life that God gives us along the way, like good meals and sunsets and sunrises and ocean views and good music and family and friends and yes, even work to provide for our families and to have a sense of purpose to help society. When we have everything we need in God, we won't be so focused on everything we lack in this life under the sun. And so the main point is the application today to honor and serve God and not money. And that points to Jesus, who said in Matthew 6:19, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. When our hearts are with God and not with money, it doesn't matter how much money we make or how much money we lose because we're not living for money. Money is just a tool. It's a means to an end, but it's not the end itself. And Jesus says in verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Jesus forces us to choose one or the other. Either God is our everything and money is just a tool, or money is our everything and God is just a tool. But they can't both be our everything. And Solomon says, if you make money your everything, you're going to be absolutely miserable and the vanity of this life will destroy your soul. But if you make God your everything, then money can come and go and we can still have joy either way. And so our prayer today is, Father, help me make you my master and not wealth. And if my heart is filled with darkness and vexation and anger because of my obsession with money, I repent today, right now, and I'm taking money off the throne of my heart, and I'm inviting you to take your rightful place there. Oh Lord, in this life filled with vanity, may my worship and service to you never be in vain.